In 1348, a man died from a tooth, not from the Black Death sweeping across continents, not from war, not from famine, not from any of the extraordinary catastrophes the 14th century had queued up for the people living inside it. From a tooth that went bad, swelled into his jaw, and spread infection into his blood, while his barber surgeon held a burning candle close to his mouth to smoke out the tiny worms believed to be living inside it. That was the treatment. That was the best available option. And the thing that should genuinely unsettle you about that story is that compared to everything else the 14th century could throw at a human body, dying from a tooth was practically a dignified exit. The 1300s did not simply have bad medicine. They had no medicine in any meaningful sense, only confident, elaborate. See, completely wrong explanations for why millions of people kept dying, paired with treatments built around those explanations that made everything measurably worse. Here is exactly why you would not have survived it. Start with this. You were not going to make it to adulthood. Not probably, not likely. Statistically, the odds were roughly even, and that is not a figure of speech. Approximately 26.9% of infants born in 14th century Europe died before their first birthday. Nearly half of all children never reached adulthood at all. In Scottish cemetery records from Aberdeen, 53% of buried individuals were under the age of 6. In Linlithgow, that number was 58%. These were not exceptional years. These were not plague years. This was the baseline. This was Tuesday in the 14th century, and you were one of the children it was Tuesday for. The average life expectancy of 30 is one of the most misunderstood numbers in all of historical discussion, and it is worth pausing on because people consistently get it wrong in the same direction. It does not mean most people died at 30. It does not mean that reaching 35 made you elderly. It means that so many people died before they reached 5 that they dragged the average down catastrophically. If you survived childhood, you might live to 60. Some people did. There were old kings, old bishops, old farmers who remembered decades. The problem was not the ceiling. The problem was the floor, and the floor was covered with children who never made it past it. Whooping cough and diphtheria were endemic, each particularly lethal in towns and cities where children transmitted infection with the efficient brutality that only the very young can manage. You had no treatment for either. Your barber surgeon had no treatment for either. What he had was the humoral framework, which meant your child had an imbalanced humor, and the prescribed intervention was the same one prescribed for almost everything else. Adjust the diet, attempt a purge, and if things looked serious enough, open a vein. The framework made no distinction between an adult with fever and an infant with whooping cough. You were a small person with unbalanced humors, and you would be treated accordingly, and the treatment would not help you. Unbaptized infants who died could not be buried in Christian cemeteries. The church's administrative requirements outlasted the children themselves, and those children were given burial rites roughly equivalent to discarded objects. The theology moved faster than the grief. Iron deficiency from extended breastfeeding was widespread and compounded illness in both mothers and infants simultaneously. Malnutrition was not a crisis. It was a condition, structural and permanent, woven into daily life across every social class below the nobility. You were most vulnerable at the very start of your life, and the world around you had no idea why, no tools to change it, and a theological infrastructure more concerned with whether you had been baptized than whether you were still breathing. Here is something worth understanding before we go any further. The medical establishment of the 14th century was not primitive in the sense of being unrefined or undeveloped. It was elaborate. It was codified. It had universities behind it, papal endorsement, and centuries of accumulated authority. Your doctor was genuinely trying to help you. He was also wrong in almost every direction simultaneously, and the confidence with which he was wrong is what made him so dangerous, because a confused doctor might hesitate, but your doctor was never confused about anything. The foundation was humoral theory, inherited from ancient Greece, and left essentially unchallenged for nearly 1,500 years by the time 1348 arrived. Your body contained 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health meant balance. Sickness meant one humor had grown out of proportion. Your treatment meant restoring equilibrium through bloodletting, purging, or induced vomiting. This was not fringe thinking. This was the curriculum at every major European university. This was what the most educated men on the continent believed with complete institutional confidence, and it was what they were about to apply to your body whether you wanted them to or not. Bloodletting was the universal answer. One medieval medical textbook listed its benefits with the enthusiasm of a man who had genuinely discovered something extraordinary. It clears the mind, strengthens memory, cleanses the gut, warms the marrow, sharpens hearing, produces a musical voice, dispels sleeplessness, drives away anxiety, and gives long life. It was prescribed for the plague, for gout, for fever, for grief, for almost any condition a human body could present. Their physicians were still prescribing it for pneumonia in 1942, which tells you something important about how long a wrong idea can survive when it has enough institutional momentum behind it. Your blood was not the problem, but it was going to leave your body regardless. The closest thing you had to a doctor was the barber surgeon. He cut your hair, pulled your teeth, removed kidney stones in public as a form of advertising, lanced plague buboes, and opened your veins on a schedule. A 1307 London ordinance had to formally prohibit barbers from displaying bowls of congealing human blood in their shop windows, not because anyone considered this unhygienic, but because it was upsetting people walking past. The barbers were reportedly annoyed. The displays from their perspective were simply good marketing, and if you did not want to look at the blood, you could look somewhere else. Anesthetic existed, in a manner of speaking. The soporific sponge was made by soaking a sea sponge in a mixture of hemlock, mandrake, ivy, mulberry juice, and opium, drying it in the sun, then reconstituting it with water and placing it under your nose before a procedure. Hemlock is a poison. The opium was almost certainly doing most of the meaningful work. Whether you survived the anesthetic before reaching whatever you needed, anesthetic 4 was, one imagines, not guaranteed. Wound treatment involved pouring boiling oil directly into open wounds to cauterize them. This practice ended only in 1536, when French barber surgeon Ambroise Paré ran out of oil at the Battle of Turin and improvised with a mixture of egg yolk, rose oil, and turpentine. His patients recovered measurably better than those treated with the oil. He concluded that neither he nor anyone else should cauterize wounds that way again. It required a supply shortage to accidentally discover that not burning someone was preferable to burning them. For tooth whitening, your barber applied aqua fortis, nitric acid, which did produce whiter teeth by dissolving the enamel entirely. And in October 1348, when King Philip VI of France commissioned the medical faculty of the University of Paris to explain what was causing the plague, 49 of the finest medical minds on the continent concluded that a triple conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in Aquarius on March 20th, 1345, had corrupted the atmosphere. That was the official explanation. That was what the institution produced. Your doctor had a theory, he had a treatment, he had 15 centuries of authority standing behind him, and every single thing he was about to do to you was going to make everything worse. The Black Death gets all the attention. It earns it. But focusing on the plague as the defining medical catastrophe of the 14th century misses something important about what your life would have looked like even if the plague had never arrived. The 1300s came fully equipped with an entire portfolio of diseases operating simultaneously, each one capable of finishing you independently, and most of them were completely invisible to the people dying from them. You did not need to encounter Yersinia pestis to be destroyed by this century. You needed only to exist within it. Dysentery was everywhere, called the flux by those suffering through it. It spread through bacteria and parasites in contaminated water and food, and it caused bloody diarrhea, fever, and dehydration severe enough to kill. It was endemic in every medieval city, village, monastery, and military encampment simultaneously. Saint Martin, Bishop of Tours, described his own bout with the disease as so devastating that he completely abandoned any hope of surviving it. The 15th century scholar Savonarola observed that dysentery moved through entire households and entire towns without distinction, striking children of 10 and men of 60 with equal indifference, and then proved his own point by contracting it himself in 1495. Nobody knew what caused it. Nobody could stop it. You caught it from your water, from your food, from the air of the room you were already living in, and you either recovered or you didn't. And your doctor's contribution to that outcome was negligible in either direction. Tuberculosis, known as the white plague or consumption, caused persistent fever and a cough that could produce blood, and it spread through the dense, damp, poorly ventilated conditions of medieval towns, monasteries, and castle servant quarters with quiet efficiency. You could carry it for years before understanding what you were carrying. Royals claimed to cure it through the ceremony of touching for the king's evil, in which sufferers of scrofula, a form of tuberculosis affecting the lymph nodes of the neck, would line up before their monarch to be healed by royal touch. Those who were touched received a specially minted coin to mark the occasion. They did not recover. The coin was a more durable outcome than the cure. St. Anthony's fire came from a fungus called Claviceps purpurea that grew on rye grain, particularly after cold or wet winters. And if you were poor in 14th century Europe, rye bread was what you ate every single day. Contaminated bread produced burning sensations in your limbs that escalated through hallucinations and convulsions into gangrene severe enough that your fingers, toes, ears, and entire limbs would blacken and separate from your body. The fungus had no taste. It had no smell. The bread looked exactly like bread was supposed to look. In 944 CE, 4,000 people in France died in a single outbreak. It had not become safer by 1348, and you had no way of knowing whether the loaf in front of you was going to give you your breakfast or your last coherent memory. Leprosy, now called Hansen's disease, developed with a cruelty particular to slow diseases, with symptoms taking decades to manifest as nerve damage, skin lesions, and progressive impairment of the eyes and limbs. Leper hospitals were established outside town centers across France and the Low Countries from the 12th century onward. If you were diagnosed, you were cast out of your city, refused burial alongside the uninfected, and declared ritually unclean under Leviticus. The social sentence arrived long before the physical one, and it arrived with the full bureaucratic authority of the church behind it. Smallpox had diminished somewhat by the 14th century as partial population immunity accumulated, but it remained present and lethal for those without it. And the treatment, wrap, rub, steam, purge, monosort pansau, zilbert sichan, and bleed the patient, was the same treatment applied to almost everything else, because the framework that generated the treatment made no meaningful distinctions between diseases. The 14th century did not need the Black Death to be a medical catastrophe. The Black Death was simply the loudest thing in a room that was already full of things trying to kill you. Before any disease found you, what you were eating and drinking was already working against you, not because of poverty alone, though poverty made everything worse, because the contamination was structural, invisible, and woven into the basic mechanics of daily survival in ways that nobody recognized and nobody had the framework to recognize. You were not making bad choices. You were making the only choices available, and the only choices available were quietly working against you. London's water infrastructure was, by the standards of the era, genuinely impressive. The Great Conduit authorized in 1236 ran a system of lead and timber pipes stretching roughly 3 to 4 miles from Springs at Tyburn to a cistern in Cheapside. 12 conduit systems served the city by the mid-14th century, with water dispensed from taps and delivered to residences by workers called water carriers for a fee. The engineering was real. The problem was that the same rivers and streams feeding that system were also receiving the full output of cesspools, latrines, slaughterhouses, and tanneries, with no separation between clean water and wastewater at any point in the process. You were drinking downstream from your own toilet, and the pipe that carried the water to your door had no way of knowing the difference. The popular belief that you avoided water and drank ale instead because you understood the water was dangerous is almost entirely wrong. Historians have documented extensive routine water consumption across all social classes. Health manuals recommended drinking from cool springs. Roughly 90% of Europe's population lived in rural areas with reasonable access to clean streams. Medieval ales contained approximately 1% alcohol, which is not enough to meaningfully sterilize anything. You were not getting safely intoxicated as an alternative to contaminated water. You were simply drinking the water, and occasionally drinking ale alongside it, and neither of those choices was as safe as you needed it to be. The cookshops lining the Thames served hot food around the clock, open every day of the year. The most popular item was the meat pie. According to a 13th century Norwich report, cooks routinely used diseased pork in their pies and served it without hesitation. Days-old spoiled pies were reheated and resold rather than discarded, because poverty made waste unaffordable, and food safety was not a concept that existed in any organized form. Undercooking was common enough to generate its own proverb: God sends the meat, but the devil sends the cooks. And your rye bread, the food you returned to every single morning, carried the possibility of ergot fungus contamination with no visible indication that anything was wrong. The bread looked correct. It smelled correct. It tasted correct. And on the mornings when the previous winter had been cold enough and wet enough, it would give you convulsions before the day was finished. Every meal was a negotiation with odds you had no way of calculating, against risks you had no language to describe. By the time the Black Death reached England in the autumn of 1348, it was not arriving into a healthy population with bad luck. It was arriving into a population already carrying dysentery, ergotism, tuberculosis, and leprosy, already being bled by its doctors, already drinking from its own sewage, already eating bread that might be slowly poisoning it. The plague did not find a civilization at its strongest and break it. It found a civilization already compromised at every level, and it simply accelerated what the century had already been doing quietly for decades. The origin has been traced with remarkable precision. A 2022 study published in Nature identified the source as Karajigak, near Lake Issyk-Kul in modern Kyrgyzstan, where tombstones from 1338 and 1339 inscribed in Syriac explicitly cite pestilence, and DNA analysis confirmed the ancestral strain of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that would go on to kill tens of millions. From Central Asia, it traveled along established trade routes to Crimea, where in 1346 the Mongol forces under Janibeg besieged the Genoese trading port of Kaffa. The plague devastated the besieging army. According to the chronicler Gabriel de Musa, the Mongols catapulted infected corpses over the city walls, though modern scholars debate whether this actually occurred. What is certain is that Genoese merchants fled Kaffa by ship while carrying the disease with them, and the disease traveled better than they did. 12 of those ships docked at Messina, Sicily, in October 1347. Most of the sailors aboard were already dead. The living were covered in black swellings, buboes oozing blood and pus, and the city expelled the fleet almost immediately. It made no difference. The plague was already ashore. Genoa, Venice, and Marseille fell by January 1348. Florence followed in March, Paris and Bordeaux in June. By late June it had crossed the English Channel to Melcombe Regis in Dorset, and by November it reached London. It moved faster than armies. It moved faster than news of itself could travel, which meant that in many places it arrived before anyone knew to be afraid of it, and by the time they were afraid, the fear was already too late. What Yersinia pestis did to your body was methodical and merciless. Or it attacked the lymphatic system, producing the characteristic buboes. Swollen, blackened masses appearing in the groin, armpits, or neck, depending on where the flea had bitten you. Fever followed, then vomiting, then a systemic collapse that killed more than half of those infected in the bubonic form. In its septicemic form, the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly, causing the skin to blacken, and death to follow within hours. In its pneumonic form, it spread through respiratory droplets and was nearly universally fatal. Your body had no meaningful immune response to offer. It had never encountered anything like this, and it showed. The medical response was everything the previous sections of this story have prepared you to expect. Your plague buboes were lanced or cauterized with hot irons. Though one popular remedy involved pressing a live plucked chicken directly against your swollen bubo to draw out the poison. Theriac, a compound of up to 80 ingredients including myrrh, cinnamon, and opiates, was administered as a universal antidote. Your blood was let. Prayer was offered. None of it worked, and the most honest account of this failure came from Guy de Chauliac, personal physician to Pope Clement VI and one of the most respected surgeons in Europe, who wrote that physicians felt useless and ashamed, that they did not dare visit the sick for fear of infection, and that when they did visit them, they could accomplish nothing. He contracted the plague himself, suffered a continuous fever and a bubo in the groin, and survived, partly because he had advised the Pope to keep fires burning continuously in his chambers, which may have unknowingly repelled the fleas carrying the disease. The most effective medical intervention of the entire plague era was accidentally invented by a man trying to keep a room warm. The scale of what followed is difficult to hold as a single fact. Giovanni Boccaccio wrote from Florence that over 100,000 died within the city walls between March and July alone. Florence lost between 50 and 80% of its population in those months. A friar in the small French village of Givry, who kept meticulous records, normally counted 28 or 29 funerals per year. In 1348, he recorded 649 deaths, half of them in September alone. Modern scholarship places the European death toll at between 30 and 65% of the entire population within 6 years. The historian Ole Benedictau estimates approximately 60%, roughly 50 million people out of 80 million. La Sirare, Princess Joan, daughter of Edward III, died in Bordeaux on her way to her own wedding. Alfonso XI of Castile, the only reigning European monarch killed directly by the plague, died besieging Gibraltar in March 1350. Pope Clement VI consecrated the Rhone River so that bodies could be dumped into it with the Church's blessing, because the cemeteries were full and there was simply nowhere left to put the dead. Agnolo di Tura of Siena buried his 5 children with his own hands, none of their titles, none of their faith, none of their physicians, and none of the 80 ingredients in their theriac bought any of them a single additional day. The plague did not find a healthy population and destroy it. It found a population already hollowed out by everything this century had already done to it, and it finished the work. Here is the darkest irony in this entire story, and it requires a moment to sit with properly. The Black Death did not only kill people, it destroyed the one hygienic practice that medieval Europe had actually been doing correctly, and left the continent measurably dirtier for the next 2 centuries as a direct consequence of surviving the thing that had made it dirty in the first place. Before the plague arrived, you lived in a Europe with a genuine bathing culture. Paris had 32 public bathhouses operating by the 13th century. Southwark, across the Thames, had 18 hot baths. Vienna had 29. Nuremberg had 14 and had built a reputation as one of the cleanest cities on the continent. Small towns frequently connected their bathhouses to local bakeries, sharing heat from the bread ovens to keep the water warm. Ferrara, a 12th century writer, reported being woken by street criers announcing that the baths were hot and open. The 14th century Italian physician Mino de Maineri catalogued 57 distinct methods of bathing. You washed your hands and face every morning as a matter of routine. Linen undergarments absorbed sweat and dirt and were changed regularly by those who could afford to change them. The infrastructure existed. The habit existed. The intention was genuinely there. After the Black Death, the belief spread and calcified that warm water opened the pores of the skin and allowed disease to enter the body. The logic followed from miasma theory the same way everything else followed from miasma theory, with a kind of internal coherence that was completely wrong. Bathhouses that had been thriving social institutions for generations began to close. The syphilis epidemic of the 1490s accelerated the collapse entirely. By 1526, the philosopher Erasmus observed that public baths, which had been the height of fashion in the Low Countries just 25 years earlier, had completely vanished. Henry VIII ordered the Southwark stews closed in 1546. The historian Catherine Aschenberg documented that Europeans became measurably less clean during the Renaissance and early modern period than they had been during the Middle Ages. The 17th century, not the 14th, turned out to be the true age of filth. The fear of disease made you more vulnerable to disease. The terror of contagion caused an entire civilization to abandon the one practice that, while it could not have stopped the plague, at least gave your body some defense against everything else. The century did not end when the plague retreated. It left behind a population that had learned precisely the wrong lesson from the worst thing that had ever happened to it. So go back to that man who died from a tooth. He was not unlucky by the standards of his time. He was ordinary. He died from something small, because in the 14th century, small things killed you with the same efficiency as large ones, and the large ones were everywhere. You would have been born into a body with roughly even odds of surviving childhood. If you made it, you would have drunk from contaminated water, eaten bread that might give you hallucinations, and been treated for any illness by someone who would drain your blood while explaining that the alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars was responsible for your suffering. And then, in 1348, something arrived that was worse than all of it combined. It was into a world with no tools to fight it and no framework that would have allowed anyone to build any. The 14th century was not a bad time to get sick. It was a bad time to be alive.